Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name's Milan, and we're back at the Compliance Corner today, and we're talking about security and compliance teams. So, today, from the blog that's linked down below, Lee and I kind of talked about the creation of teams, decentralized or centralized, and kind of how do they come about, what things you should consider if you're inheriting or you're creating one, and really some of the pros and cons and challenges. So with that, we're going to go ahead and switch over. I'll bring Lee on, and we will go ahead and start talking about compliance teams. Lee, welcome. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. Hopefully, my internet stays stable this time.
That's right. So a couple of points of clarification before we get started. As always, these are our opinions and don't necessarily reflect those of our company, as you can see below. And also, if you have questions, we do have the ability to take questions. So please use a Q colon in the chat, and we'll get to the question before the end of the stream if we don't get to it immediately. So Lee, let's start talking real quickly and briefly about when leaders are creating or maturing their organization and they're considering a centralized or decentralized organizational structure, what sort of things should they consider initially?
um, so I'm working. So I um, you know, if you're enough to, or if you, build one from
Oh,
scratch,
hang on.
I
Lee, I think you're
think
breaking up here for a second.
okay.
There goes Lee's internet. He was having that issue last week.
But you can maybe you can get
Yeah, I'll go ahead and go first. So from a compliance perspective, I know one of the things that I consider is usually you have to think about what role is your compliance team going to take, because there's some big differences in how you staff teams based on their role. For example, are you just going to be doing writing policy, or are you going to be actually doing auditing? And most importantly, are you going to be doing governance? Because the scope really does matter, because in compliance organizations, you can take more of this role if you just want to do the auditing, then hand the information over to the engineering and compliance and the engineering teams. They may or may not actually oversee the governance. They may just provide them the information and then take the step back, so we've given it to you. Or if you're going to follow up and help them devise solutions and then work with the auditors, well, that's more of a governance role, and that could actually increase the cost and scope and complexity and the engagements you actually have to have with the teams, depending on what the success criteria you're setting. So it really kind of depends on when you start the organization, what role you expect them to have. And we'll talk a little bit later about what it means, as a small team or a startup versus a megacorp in terms of what the complexities are. But literally, when I look at it, I initially start with the scope and the roles and the success criteria of the initial team that you're looking at. Lee, I don't know if you're back yet. Oh, looks like he's having issues. Murphy's Law. So one of the things that you also want to consider when setting up the team is organizationally, what is it that you want them to, what role? Oh, one second here. Okay, Lee, looks like you're back. I got you on the phone.
Yep, got me on the phone, so we'll try it this way.
Awesome. Okay. Well, hey, we gotta love technology having multiple options.
Oh man, sorry everyone. So yeah, let's chime in for the first one. So I think if you've been fortunate enough to inherit or can build right your program, one thing I think you need to consider right is the authority and responsibility right for that program. And I've seen difficulty with programs where multiple people.
Boy, we are not having luck technically today. One second, everyone. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and continue, and we will bring Lee back if we can. We are not having much technical luck today. It was working just fine before the stream actually started. So, again, my apologies. So one of the things that I know that Lee and I talked about in the blog is does company size, organizational maturity, and other factors influence the decision of having a centralized or decentralized? And what I think a lot of it comes down to is what is the scope, complexity of your actual product or products that you're working on. Because, for example, if when you start off as a smaller company or as a startup, you probably have one product and you're probably moving into limited markets. Now, the challenge with that is, well, that one is you have a limited number of resources. So it tends to be centralized by default, as the overall team is probably pretty small. And you probably don't have a lot of various organizations that you have to integrate into in terms of uh, ensuring that there's consistency across the group. Because if you have like one engineering team, well, it's a pretty direct conversation with them and you can work with them much more directly. But if you have multiple engineering teams, sometimes across different countries, it could be much more challenging in terms of what it means to actually work across all these different domains. And so when you have the difference between whether you're thinking of a smaller or a larger, it really comes down to the complexity of the product. So Lee, I was just talking about what are some factors that determine whether a centralized or decentralized and how they actually come about. And I was talking about a startup where you have a small team, one engineering team likely, you have a small scope of market that you're probably even going to initially, so you don't have the resources for a large team, so you probably end up with a small centralized team of a few individuals. Now in the compliance world, I can tell you that's what I've seen with many of the small firms that I've consulted with, that they don't have a lot of people. So how do they deal with that? But then again, their scope is small, they don't have a lot of funding. So in the security world, Lee, what do you see in terms of when they're starting like a startup in small companies? How does that organically grow?
Yeah, I see the same thing, and the trend seems to be every time I start talking, my internet goes down. So we'll see. But the trend seems to be the same thing, is that for a startup, right, where you're a very small company and your product or service is focused, right, you really want to make sure that you're spending your time and your money right wisely, and it might be difficult, right, to justify having the investment for right a dedicated security leader or dedicated security team. And so, that's where I've seen it be more decentralized and the responsibilities, distributed right across multiple people, usually like some sort of IT function, maybe product, maybe under the CTO or whatever it's going to be. And then, as you've, talked about as well, right, is at some point, right, there's an inflection point with that where it starts to make sense to say, hey, we're big enough, right? And it's difficult to have one leader, for example, let's say it's under the CTO, right? At some point that person's remit or the function is going to get big enough, their scope is big enough where they can't spend enough time, right, and they don't have enough team members to be able to focus on right compliance or security or whatever it's going to be. And now it's like, hey, like we're missing things, there's now a risk to the business, or maybe you got breached, right? Maybe you missed some sort of compliance activity, and therefore your customers can't use your product, whatever it's going to be. Now there's this inflection point that says, look, we obviously have an issue with the way the team is set up now, decentralized. We should think about really centralizing this under a single leader. All right, and the advantages of that, right, which we'll talk about in a bit. But one of the advantages, you have someone, right, whose sole focus and expertise is in that domain, whether it's compliance, whether it's security. They know all of the things that have to happen, such as dealing with incidents or what audits they need to do, what customers care about, all of those type of things, right? And having someone who's more of a generalist, right? A CTO, a CIO, chief legal counsel, whatever, which is sometimes the reporting structure, right, for these functions. They're not necessarily experts in those fields. And so it can be difficult for them to allocate enough time or expertise to those functions without having a centralized team under a single leader. So, those are some of the things that I've seen where like a startup kind of it definitely needs to make business sense, but at some point there's an inflection point, and they think, yes, this should be great. We should centralize that going forward.
Yes, and I think I've seen a lot of that as well, particularly when you move into a large multinational company, they're already going to have a lot of established teams with various levels of ownership and scope, and that's not going to change due to the complexity. So let's move right into the advantages and disadvantages of each model. Let's start with the decentralized model first. So let's talk about any advantages and disadvantages there. So what would you say? Go ahead and tell us what you think about those.
So, I mean, it depends on how the organization is structured, right? And I think this is maybe the next topic, but it depends also on the organizational and cultural and maturity of that. But from a decentralized standpoint, one sort of nice thing about it, I would say, or one advantage is that you are distributing the budget and the resources across different teams. And so let's just say that you were like a product focused company, you had 10 different products, and you said, great, every product team needs to focus on security. They would fund and staff, right, security according to their budget to make sure that it's funded. And then that would be tied to like the success of the product. That might be a great way, right, to kind of link that function, right, to a revenue generating customer type focused of a team, as opposed to sometimes what happened in a centralized team is they look at the centralized org, right, and they say, wow, this thing costs a lot of money, what's it doing for us? And you're like, well, hang on a second, right, it actually does a lot for you in terms of like an insurance policy, or it may indirectly, right, drive revenue. And so that can be a little bit of a pitfall, right, in a centralized team. However, right, decentralized teams, I'll go to the cons now. Decentralized teams can run into a whole host of issues, such as I've seen the resources go native, right? So like you staff a person into a team and they're supposed to be doing security or compliance stuff, and you check in on them like, oh, just kidding, I was writing product features. And you're like, wait, no, you're supposed to be doing something else, right? And then also same thing is that like not only going native, but the team could look at the budget and they could be like, well, we can't afford to have 5 people for security, we're going to cut them down to 2. Well, hang on a second, like we still have things that team needs to do. Yeah, but we can't afford it, and so we're just going to cut it, right? So I definitely think that the decentralized team, certainly it can work up to a point, but there's a lot of inherent pitfalls and risks that come with it in terms of like funding, resource control, just all of those things that I've seen tons and tons of issues with, that usually a centralized team, which we'll talk about next, avoid, assuming that you do it correctly.
Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of those. And I think for me, there are advantages of a decentralized team. One of them for me is that the resources are really close to the engineering teams, right? Like when they are embedded in the teams, they can actually, whether it's coach them or basically design with them, but the resources are on the ground. As us military people like you and I say, boots on the ground is always good, right? So that is definitely one of the benefits, is they tend to be able to insert themselves much closer to design time in most cases, which again is great because now you're designing better from the beginning versus just coming in after the fact, swooping in and retroactively supporting them. That's definitely one of the big benefits, other than the ones that you've already talked about, which I agree in terms of costing and funding. The line of business is responsible for their product all up. I think that's all great. I think some of the disadvantages, though, is I also agree with you that there are times where you're competing with resourcing against, direct customer facing requirements or other things. And since it's not a direct revenue generator, sometimes it's a little more difficult to show the value and why you have to invest, and sometimes invest even more, because it's much harder to put the cost and the value and benefit on the risk factor, which a lot of people use in terms of what it means to actually invest more, which is all for the brand name and all for the customer, but it's much harder to articulate the metrics of success for that when the whole job is prevention, right? Don't allow this stuff to happen. So I think that, along with what you said, those are some of the big pros and cons that I see that are really challenging with decentralized teams. There's also another factor I'm going to put out there on the challenges, which is the more decentralized it is and the less there's how do I put it, a scope responsibility, you tend not to be able to have more senior people because there's no scope for that. So it doesn't mean that the people you don't have are good, but when it comes to the associate levels of authority, they can get embedded pretty deeply and be multiple levels from the real, senior people where you're discussing these key issues. And that could be somewhat challenging to try to bring up these issues in a way. They might not even have the same skills if they're not very senior at that point, to articulate it and then compete against these other resourcing challenges that the senior leaders have. So it's a very, it's a very push and pull. And we'll talk a bit more about, ideal solutions later. But I think those are some of the key areas and challenges with a decentralized team. Well, let's go ahead and switch it now to centralized. Oh, go ahead.
Well,
Sorry,
actually,
Lee.
I was going to add one point to that, which is not just in scope, but I think strategy, right? So one thing that I didn't mention that I'll tack on to what you said is that with a decentralized team, what I've seen sometimes is because there's no coordination or overall centralized strategy of those resources, you end up in having a lot of duplicate efforts. So, for example,
Right.
like an engineering team says, "Hey, I need to build an asset inventory," and then they find that three other teams have also built it, but it's all a different way. And so now you can have a centralized version, just all sorts of things, right? And so, again, I do agree the decentralized teams offer the advantage of the resources being close to the function they need to assist the most. But there's also, right, that lack of kind of command and control, if you will, that means they're much more ripe for repurposing or abuse or duplication of effort, which is also not a very efficient use of company resources. We can move to centralized.
No, I totally agree with you. I've seen that also where, again, you hire people for one thing. Hey, we have an emergency in another area, so they get pulled off. That is one of the challenges we decentralize. Plus, as you say, in large organizations, especially mega organizations, decentralizing, you have to completely duplicate those teams and resources. There's no economies of scale or even standardization across them. And as we talked about in one of the previous podcasts, is now that the regulations are changing where you have to attest for the entire company that there's a consistent way of doing things or that they're covering it. In a decentralized model in a large organization, it makes it even more challenging because now you have to try to tie, and those teams might not even interpret what's required the same way. So now you're not only can you not standardize, they don't even agree with the standardization, and there's no decision maker either. There's no one person who can say, hey, based on the whole needs of the company, we need to kind of approach this one security or compliance thing this way. And so that also becomes a challenge because now you have two different things you have to go solve in potentially multiple different areas of the company. So yeah, that's a really great point to put on top of that the decentralized model can definitely raise some challenges there as well. So let's move on to centralized. Let's talk about that, and then we have a great question that asks for both that we'll cover. So, Lee, what do you think about centralized organizations? Let's start with the cons, and then we'll go to the pros.
So I'd say the biggest con of a centralized organization is, you're consolidating all of those things into a function where, I've seen from a budgetary standpoint or like a functional, effectiveness standpoint, if you don't have a very tight relationship with, say, finance or with your boss that does the budgeting or whatever, they can come and be like, why do you have 100 people, right? What are they all doing? Like, how come operations isn't doing this, right? And then we have to cut 20%. And it's like, well, hang on a second, right? We still have these risks, right, that we're doing. Like, you're not decreasing my risk, but you're decreasing my resources. So you're actually increasing the risk, right? And so I can see it because you have that centralized visibility, they'll look at it and be like, this thing costs us, 10 million or 50 million in P&L. We have to cut that because we just don't see the value in it. And that can be a difficult conversation to have because, again, the team is centralized and you have things to do there. The other thing I've seen with centralized teams is that, if the team is what I like to call the security mafia, right? So if you're going around and telling everyone no, right, and you don't enable the business, having it be a centralized team just means that now everyone knows who not to talk to, and so you're not going to achieve what you want, and they're just going to bypass you because you're don't go talk to Lee, right? Because blah 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 blah. So I do think like culturally and budgetarily and kind of resource wise, it can be difficult, and that's where we've talked in previous podcasts. And I'll mention them here, is that with a centralized team, right, you have to be really, really conscious about linking back from a security standpoint, what that team is doing and how it's addressing risk, kind of like your insurance policy. It's like, hey, I live in a flood zone, therefore I'm going to have a flood insurance policy. If you take that policy away and my house gets flooded, then obviously, everyone loses, right? So I think that's the same type of thing with a security team. And then also, I do think, really good security leaders, right? If you're not in a very customer facing role, like for example, if you don't work in a company that makes actual security products,
Mhm.
I do think putting the effort to engage with the sales teams or go to market teams and then track those efforts to link back so that when the budgetary conversations do come up, you can be like, well, hang on, like my team drove, $10 million of indirect revenue because of all these customer engagements. We answered all these questions and contract negotiations and helped to drive sales, et cetera, et cetera. And that can really kind of be a little bit of a get out of jail free card, but also tooting your own horn and the value, right, of a centralized organization. So let's talk about the pros if you want, or I can stop and let you weigh in on the
Yeah,
disadvantages.
let's stick around on that for a minute because I want to build on
Okay.
top of what you were saying.
Yeah,
Then
go for it.
we'll move to the cons. So I really agree with everything you're saying, and I'll add just a slightly different spin on it from a compliance perspective. And I totally agree. Like, how do you show the value in a central organization of, especially in a large one, what the value that you're providing to the businesses? And this is where, when we talked about how metrics need to change, I think as we move forward, as we need to scale more with all these new security and compliance requirements, that I think that's been challenged on how do you make that value story. And I'm going to call it a value story because it is kind of a complete story. You touched upon a couple of areas that I agree with. We call that compliance. Well, for us, it's compliance enablement. How much revenue and how are you helping enable new revenue, right? With customers directly. I think there are metrics you can do there. But then the other one is, I don't think any senior leader I've ever talked to disagrees that you have to invest in security and compliance. I mean, it's the number one trust vehicle for customers. It's your brand name if you have an issue. The real challenge for me has always been how efficient and effective are you? Because I can tell you in my experience, they always think we're inefficient. Like, hey, we're not, like, this takes a lot of time, and all the anecdotals of, in the compliance where you come back for evidence multiple times, and why do I have to gather these logs? And so all of that comes down to a metric that I talked about previously as well that hasn't traditionally been tracked, which is time. And then I also think that one of the challenges that we didn't really touch upon is a lot of the central teams don't have a great tie in with the engineering teams, right? Like, a lot of them are not engineers and they're sitting outside the organization. They're not close to boots on the ground. And so trying to tie that translation down is even more difficult when you're outside the organization usually, or you're a large central one even within, and you don't really understand as much about how the engineers do work, what's valuable to them, and how do they measure success, and then tying those success metrics together. Because I was talking about this, I'm going to talk about this next week, I think, with somebody else, is that, like, what's the makeup of a lot of people, especially in compliance? Now, in security, a lot more of them are engineering, so it helps a little bit. But again, as you say, how do you measure that risk metric in a way that resonates for the justification of the cost of an organization? I think is going to be an ongoing challenge. And it's definitely one of the harder ones in a centralized organization to ensure that year over year, that the value that you're providing is measurable in a way that resonates with the people that are paying the centralized bill. And I think that's one of the areas that I think is just going to be an opportunity as we move forward to make that better so the organizations can meet the needs that they need without as much friction as I know I've seen in the past in certain areas when it comes to trying to fund, especially future things that don't have an immediate payoff in terms of ROI in financial dollars. That becomes really challenging. So yeah, I totally agree, Lee. Is there anything else, any rebuttal on that one before we move on to the pros?
No, one thing I will say though, and this might be worthy of a future topic, is some of the biggest pitfalls that I've seen in a centralized org is when the risk tolerance of the leader differs from the risk
That's
tolerance of the
true. Yeah.
business. Right. And so you kind of touched on it a little bit, but like if you go right to, the CTO or the CFO or the CEO and you're like, hey, this thing is a risk, we should fund it. And they're like, well, that then you have a difference, right? And maybe it's okay. Maybe where they acknowledge the risk. Yes, I understand, but I don't feel like it's that big a risk. Great, that's a good response, right? But if they're like, I don't believe it's a risk, that's totally different. And now you're on different wavelengths, and that can lead to issues where you are seeing or you think you're seeing risks or things you need to do from a compliance standpoint, and they don't see it. And so therefore, you're trying to get funding or budget or convince them that you're going to have an incident or whatever it's going to be. And they're like, whatever. And like that can lead to some really big discontinuity, right, in how the business and the function is run. So it's something to think about as well for a centralized group.
Yeah, that is a great topic. And I can tell you that that's one of the biggest ones I think we all contend with, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit even more later, is really how do you articulate the impact of a potential thing like that? Because it's not the $1 billion lawsuit, right? Like nobody, that doesn't really resonate with anyone because the likelihood of that is really slim to nil. So what really is a good way to articulate an impact in a way that would resonate with the engineering leaders? I know on the compliance side, I've talked about that in a couple previous podcasts, but you do have to make that connection where you either agree and commit, which is you agree or you disagree and commit, meaning you both at least disagree, but the leader understands the potential implications and is prepared to accept those. I mean, that's why they're the senior leader. But a lot of times, a lot of times I've seen where the story or the impact is very fuzzy or ambiguous. And so it's really hard to say that they truly understood what that impact could be. So I get that is definitely a challenge that the compliance or security leaders have to deal with today about how to resonate those risks in order to either determine funding or to fund something new. So that's great. Yes, let's go ahead and move on then to the advantages.
Sure. I mean, I'm a big fan of centralized for the sole reason that while everyone can be a leader, there can only be one leader, right? There can only be one person making that decision, right? So everyone can exhibit the qualities of a leader, but you can really only have one person at the top, right? Otherwise, what you have is conflict in terms of who's actually making the decision, who's responsible, who has the authority to do those things. And then you just get into either stalemates, right, where nothing is happening, or you get into duplication of effort where some person's like, well, I control that and you don't control that, or vice versa, and then everyone's just kind of warring after it. And I've seen that mostly in decentralized teams where or heavily matrix teams too, right, where which is big in the defense contracting space, right, where you have teams and it's like, oh well, we're going to have two leaders kind of share these resources and split their time. Well, that's great, but maybe it makes sense from a financial standpoint or a contractual billing standpoint to the customer, but from an actual decision making standpoint, someone unfortunately, whoever's the bigger personality and whoever maybe has the esprit de corps of the team, they're going to be the one that controls those resources, right? So for me, a centralized team just really consolidates the focal point, the strategy, the thought leadership, just all of the direction and personality of that org, right, is with that one person. And it's not ambiguous, because ambiguity to me is just the biggest sort of downfall of a lot of organizations in terms of performance and efficiency. And so, yeah, it consolidates the budget, it consolidates the risk, it consolidates a lot of different things, but now it's kind of one-stop shop for the org to go to that team to say, hey, can you help enable us? Yes, I'm here. I can coordinate these things. Oh, your asset inventory is broken. I will fix that in a centralized way so everyone can benefit, instead of everyone going out and building 10 different solutions. And really what should happen with a centralized team, if you do it correctly, is you offload the rest of the business, right? So now the engineering resources or the product resources or HR or whoever doesn't have to worry about, am I using TLS? And, do I have this control? And what do I need to do for this product? It's like, nope, we have a way for you to do it. This is the path. If you want to deviate from the path, that's great. We'll talk about risk. But overall, we've tried to cognitively offload the rest of the business with this centralized org to really make sure that the business can do what it needs to do, which is operate in an environment with minimal risk, right?
Yeah, I agree with that. I'd say there's a couple of other advantages. I mean, we can talk about how the team can scale out. It can then use resourcing across multiple areas efficiently. You don't have to duplicate efforts, right? All of that is good. And I also think there's another aspect we really haven't touched upon yet, which is also a negative, which I forgot to call out on a decentralized, is that when you have a centralized team, you actually have more of career paths for people. It's more of a place where people want to go because you have critical mass of like-minded people who are getting rated against like-minded work. I can tell you from being a unicorn on a small compliance team, it's really hard to have individuals as unicorns and ensure they have a career path, right? Because they're not doing anything consistent with other people. So how do you actually rate them? And I think that's one of the challenges with decentralized. That's an advantage of a centralized team, is you have this critical mass of similar people that can learn from each other. They can train with each other. Then they can also have more critical mass for expectations of work, and then also like identifying different levels and giving them real career paths. It's really hard on a small decentralized team to not be a unicorn, and eventually pretty much you get stuck because you don't have the scope to go bigger. You can't really scale out past a certain point. And so I think one of the advantages of a centralized team is you can really offer some real longer term careers for people where they don't feel they have to go somewhere else in order to grow, because there's just no headroom, because there's no other opportunities that they have in that line. So then you lose mind share, right? Then you have to retrain new people, you get the revolving door, and it becomes very challenging. So I think that is one of the other big advantages, not to mention all the costing and efficiencies that you get in order to actually then grow careers for people and actually grow a long-term team. And I find that that becomes one of the biggest benefits, is that you can then really build organizational value and knowledge over time, which then also allows you to really move the business forward because they become experts not only in their domain, whether it's compliance or security, but also the products that they're working on. So I think that's also one of the big benefits I see with a centralized team. So we had a great question. I'm going to throw it up here from Vanessa here. Okay, so are there considerations that could unblock some of the pitfalls of each models? Do you have experience of solutions that have proven successful? And Vanessa, we're going to hold part of that probably for our final answer, which is, what do we think the right answer is long term? I think that will answer part of it as well. But I also then, let me throw this one up as well. Rephrase, can you share experiences of successful solutions around known pitfalls for each of the models? Okay, so Lee, why don't you give us one example, and then I'll give an example as well of an actual experience with one of the models.
Yeah, sure. So the names will remain anonymous, but at a past company that I was at, they had a heavily matrixed decentralized team, and my remit was to control some of those resources. I had some that reported directly to me, and then some that were kind of matrixed across teams and were embedded. And I did see a couple issues, and really the issue boiled down to who controls the performance review and who controls the funding. And over time, what happened was, because I shared those resources at the time with another vice president, and I was only a director at the time, that vice president just kept trumping me and taking the resources. And eventually he just took half the team. He's like, well, these should just report to me. Before that happened, what I found was two things. The resources would go native, right? Because I didn't control the budget or the performance review. And so the team that controlled that, which was the application team, they would just do whatever that team wanted, because they were like, well, I'm not going to get rated by Lee. I'm going to get rated by this team. So I'm going to do whatever they want me to do. Right. And so it was a little bit difficult, right, to actually achieve what we wanted to in terms of that, just because in that decentralized model, it was very ripe for, I don't know if abuse is the right word, but it was ripe for it not to work as efficiently as it could have, which the goal in that model was to have resources embedded directly with the application or engineering teams, and then to have them do security things because they were failing a lot of their requirements from an external standpoint to build the products in a secure way. So that was a model where it was sort of the nail in the coffin for me against decentralized models. I had previous experience with like defense contracting, the same thing, right? Where it's like you end up like the office space is like, I have 8 bosses, Bob, right? And it's like, because you're matrixed across like 6 different orgs, so they all want to bill you out to contractors, and it's like, well, who am I supposed to listen to today, right? And so it just becomes very difficult, to your point, at the lower individual contributor levels to really feel engaged, to really feel like you have a path, to really feel like you're not just some siloed resource all on your own trying to keep your thumb in the dam from everything breaking, because you're just kind of in your own little world that isn't given a lot of view on the strategy and what's going on bigger. So that's my experience with decentralized teams and why I'm not a big fan. Someone feel free to correct me. I'm sure there's those other models that, I've seen it work and it's great. Yeah. Sure. Great. Obviously, but I think Milan and I will generally align towards the centralized model just based on our experience.
Yeah, my example's somewhat similar. I was the unicorn compliance person on a major product, and it was challenging because not only was I the only one, but I was also pretty junior at the time. And so when we had to go do this work, like the path to try to get approval, first you fight the organizational hierarchy, meaning that your level's down. Then you don't have the the positional authority to do it, and then you have to get really creative with metrics. And so while I think it can work, and it did work, the speed of innovation now doesn't allow for that kind of process in a decentralized manner. The business is moving too fast. The rate of innovation and how fast code and features are moving, it becomes really challenging to go do that. So what, the pitfall is that you can't make a decision quickly, because when you're not a decision maker, and you can't even get to the decision makers very quickly, because decentralized teams tend to get buried pretty far down in the organization because they don't have scope, they don't have size. That's just kind of what I've seen in almost every industry. So how you get around that is you really have to not only build relationships over time, which is challenging, but you have to, goes back to changing the metrics into something that's going to resonate with the senior leader. And it's not going to be, and it wasn't for me at the time, the risk, because the risk is very ambiguous and it's unrealized. By the time you realize the risk, well, now they'll spend money, but it's too late. So how do you change that dynamic and that story to something that's going to actually resonate with the leader who's looking at things like availability, signed contracts, right? Like, what is that metric that's going to be equal to those, so you get equal billing, or at least consideration on a regular basis? And I think that's one of the challenges with a decentralized model, particularly if you don't understand what that leader really resonates against, because building that model can be difficult, because again, everybody knows you have to do it, security and compliance, but the metrics for success are not normally what I would call a proactive metric that will get them to change ahead of time. Most of the time it's reactive. Oh, I had an incident. We talked about that. Well, now you have to go do why. But how do you actually fund out and value the work before that based on the opportunity risk of it happening is part of what the big challenge is, I think, with a decentralized team. And for me, the way I was able to manage it was I had to change my metrics into something that they cared about, which was kind of an orthogonal metric. For example, what I used was code flow versus the compliance work. If you didn't do the compliance work and it got caught late, that would stop your code flow, which they cared about. They didn't care about the compliance item. They cared about whether or not that code was going to make it into production. So, but when I focused on that, say, hey, this compliance work, we have to catch it before it goes. It's going to stop your, it'll stop for 3 weeks. So by the time you go do a fix and you retest it, like, we can't have 3 weeks. So, so if you did this check early and didn't allow it at the lower branches, then your code flow will go through in 4 days, right? Different metrics, same result for me. I got the compliance items fixed. So that's just an example for me how I changed metrics in order to get the visibility I needed based on what they cared about in order to get it through. So hopefully, Vanessa, that helped with the question, at least as an example. So Lee, I think what we...
Oh yeah, go ahead. Vanessa might care about, which is, I'll talk about centralized teams this time. So, so I've also had with a centralized team where, great, it's all centralized, right? The authority is there and everything like that. But I've had issue where the culture, right? Same what you were talking about. Teams are still pushing code. There's still vulnerabilities, right? There's still technical debt, all these type of things. And because we were centralized and didn't have resources that sat with the engineering teams, are like, oh, well, they don't understand, right, our use case. And so therefore we're just going to ignore them or whatever it's going to be, right? And so to your point, the centralized team or the decentralized team both kind of have inherent advantages or disadvantages. But I think you coined it, which is like, if you don't have that good relationship with those teams or those businesses and really explaining the value there, I've seen even in a centralized team where the engineering resources were like, nah, we're not going to do that. And, part of that, how you fix that is exactly what you talked about, is like, okay, now either culturally it has to change where, there are a bunch of studies out there, like there's a book called Accelerate, which talks about how like really, really strong cultures actually also overperform in like code velocity and like security and compliance and things like that. But absent from the culture, if you have technical debt that are holding the teams back, if you have not the ability, right, to control, for example, some of the technology stacks, like the pipeline, or, whether things can be put into production vulnerable, et cetera, you need to kind of put that foundational things in place so that you can do what you're talking about, which is like, oh, hey, you didn't do this thing, therefore you can't do this other thing. I get you don't think this first thing is as important, but it actually is really important to the whole business to function that way. Therefore, we need you to fix this thing before you go into production. And that, kind of changes behaviors and starts changing the culture where they realize, right, that, oh, we should go talk to security because they are the experts in this thing, right? I'm getting blocked and pushed into production. I need help because I don't understand why I'm getting blocked. Great, let's have that conversation. Oh, this was a false positive. Oh, no, this was actually a critical vulnerability. Let me explain why this was a bad thing, a SQL injection, whatever. So I've seen it. If you have some of these organizational, cultural, technology debt type issues, and the centralized team, even though it's centralized, can still run into a lot of issues if you don't have the ability to actually enforce, right, those things that you're trying to do, and not enforce in a way that's like the mafia, but enforce in a way that's like, hey, this is a risk. You can accept that risk. That's okay, but you can't ignore the risk. Ignoring the risk is the wrong response right there, right?
Yeah, I just last thing for me on that is I totally agree, and I think that that's a big part of the challenge. Is we talk about building the relationship. Well, how do you build the relationship if you don't understand the other side? And I can tell you that a lot of times engineering doesn't understand compliance. Compliance doesn't understand engineering. So how do you bridge that understanding together, which is really what we're talking about? What's a win-win scenario? And sometimes it's how you frame it. And I think that's been one of the things that I know I always try to focus on is, speak the engineer's language. When I was on the engineering team, the compliance team would come to me with these completely ridiculous asks with risks that meant nothing to my senior leaders because they would never happen the way they said. And that's not a way to build a relationship, to build trust. They just thought they could use, the blank checkbook and the bat when it came to compliance, right? Like, hey, you have to go do it. Well, not anymore because they'll just refuse to do it. And then you get nothing. So I totally agree that building that relationship and how you go about that is really critical to having a successful compliance, I think, or security organization, because otherwise you're not going to get them to do any of the work. So I think that's a really great note to finish on for that. Before we get to the final section, which is, okay, what do we think the best model is then? I'll let you go first.
So, I think you and I both wrote in the blog post that it depends, right? But here's what I'll say that in my experience, what I think the best model is. And I actually think it's a hybrid. And so what I think you need, and obviously this depends on your organization size and funding and et cetera, et cetera. But let's just say we had a blank check and, the organization let us do whatever we want. In an ideal world, what I would say is you need a centralized function, right, to offload the rest of the business for certain things, right? So you need centralized governance, you need centralized risk management, you need centralized compliance, you need centralized all sort of things that the business should hopefully not have to cognitively think about, but they do contribute to, right? Centralized asset inventory, centralized logging, all of these things, right? But where I do think the hybrid model comes into play is I think it's advantageous, right, to take security resources that are beholden and controlled by that centralized organization and embed them with the engineering teams. And this has been proven, I think, for me at least, really effective, because now what you have is you have resources sitting shoulder to shoulder with the engineering or product or business owners, but they report into, and the funding and performance reviews are controlled by security. So they're doing what you want them to do, but they build the expertise for that business area, the application, the product, whatever it's going to be. They build that expertise to be able to really, like we talked about, build that mind share, build that credibility, build that empathy, right, with that unit, so that when you come to them and say, this is a risk, I need you to do this thing, and the engineers are like, I can't fit that in my sprint, I don't know what you're talking about, right? That person, guy, gal, whoever, can be like, no, this is why it's important, right? If you launch that API and you don't do X, Y, and Z, we're going to get breached, and then therefore we're all going to be in the news and it's going to be bad, right? Oh, okay, great. I'll add that in. Oh, how do I do that? Well, okay, here's the 3 lines of code that I recommend, blah, 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 right? So they're acting as a trusted partner there. But the difference that I've seen is that they're not hired and controlled by, right, that application or engineering team. They're hired and controlled by security, and then placed in there as a resource to really help that team achieve what they want to achieve from a security or compliance standpoint. And that model tends to work because it also draws back on what you talked about, is like, hey, that person wants to grow. I've had enough of product or application or engineering security. I can then move back into the centralized org as a career path, right? And now do governance or risk or incident response or whatever it's going to be, right? And then people similarly can be like, oh, wow, I'm an architect, even though I'm in the central architecture review of security, but I really like this product. I'm going to go in and help them like get their stuff better and then move back out, right? So it gives you a lot of flexibility there. And then also, I think, the inherent models we talked about, with budgeting and proving value and all those type of things, I found that hybrid model works very well. I've also found, though, the hybrid model works best in very large organizations, right? This is not a startup type thing where it's like, hire 100 people and distribute them out. I mean, we're talking organizations that have either grown organically and they're now, multiple thousands of people, or organizations that have acquired via acquisition, right? And that model tends to work very well for that as well, because you have a centralized kind of corporate security team, and then they're able to go and help the companies that they acquired, right, kind of assimilate, if you will, into what the processes of the overall company want to be by embedding those resources or augmenting their existing security teams, wherever it's going to be. So that's my recommendation. If you have a blank check, or you're starting as a new CISO or compliance officer and can do whatever you want to do, go with the hybrid model, focusing with centralization to get standardization across the board, and then embedding those resources that you control into those areas that you need to give the most love. That way you kind of get the best of both worlds.
Yeah, no, I think, if anybody did read the blog, you'd see that we're probably both pretty well aligned on that. So I'll give my 2 cents for that. But when I do, I'm going to go ahead and answer this question that came through as well, which is, what is your thought on compliance as a function which is embedded in a business function, example, finance or HR decentralized? So I'll answer that question as I give my overall answer. I still think that the best, even from the start, is to start with a centralized, because as it grows, it's much easier then to use what I call as the hub and spoke model, which is really what you're talking about in terms of a hybrid, where you have a very strong hub and then you have these spokes embedded in the business as the boots on the ground. I think I've actually used that model in the past. The only difference is that the business unit, the business line that had the hub paid for the hub, because it's, in the end, they're doing work on their product. So that was just one little nuance. And it did tend to work, because what happened is a lot of those people, if they did want to go into a true security field, they would move across. But you'd also get people, and there was a defined job description for them where it was like time spent on both things. And again, it depends on your organization. Can you make it work? But the hub and spoke model, I think, works really well. And I think if you start out centralized, even if you're starting as a small business or a small startup with only a couple of compliance people, I do think that centralized is better. And to answer this question, I don't think they're good when they're embedded, because that goes back into the decentralized model. And you can go back and look at the earlier about why that is. But the reason I'll speak about it here is that I think you need to have separate but equal functions for this with the senior engineering leaders. So you can have the right level of risk discussion. You also have the right level of articulating that risk with the right business leader that's also independent of it coming up through the fox guarding the hen house. Because I do think that if you look at it later, let's say there is an incident and it's because a certain decision wasn't made, they're going to do a forensic analysis of how that decision was made. And they're going to go back and say, well, this junior compliance person on this team raised it to their manager and it never went any higher. And what do you expect that person to go do? Was that decision really made at the right level? Now, in more mature organizations, that's easier, but I still think it's a big risk in a decentralized function. And then you still don't get the economies of scale. You still don't get the, being able to hire, you still have to hire multiple teams to do the same job across many different decentralized areas. So I think the strong central hub is definitely important. I think that if you don't have that, then you can't build that, not only economies of scale, but the careers of people that will stay and actually grow with the business, offer them different roles. But I do think you also have to have the boots on the ground, because if you don't have those people embedded who understand what I call the 80% scenario, which is they may not be complete experts, at least on the compliance side, but if they're going through an architectural review and they start talking about adding new telemetry points and shipping these points, they're going to know enough to ask the question before they go build the product, saying, I may not understand, like I might not be a privacy expert and understand full telemetry, but I better go ask the people, because this is raising radars in my head. And that really saves a lot of time. And that was the value of that model where we instituted it before, was because they didn't have to be experts at the central level. They would escalate to them. They could help them get the right answers. But they knew enough to ask the harder questions, or at least slow it down enough to get the right answers. And people said that would slow things down. As a matter of fact, it actually saved them time, because through this process, what we found was that we caught so many more things. So we started documenting what they were catching before they started moving code, because we had checks, senior scanning checks and stuff before the code went to production. If you caught it there, then they had to go back and retool everything. So we actually started tracking this. And what we found was that our spokes were helping the business team move code faster because they were keeping them out of trouble at design time and initial implementation time. And I think that's the value of the partnership. And I also think it's important that for the central team, they have to get really good at resonating their value laterally to their engineering peers and obviously the people, the board that's paying their salaries. And I still think that requires you to change the metrics a little bit to make them more equitable to the more immediate impacts, such as code flow, such as customer downtime, if you have to go fix things in production when you find them after the fact. And I think that's what makes a really effective organization and program, is when you have this separate but independent view, as well as the embedding in the teams, so you can have the right levels of conversation across the business lines.
Yeah, if I had to pick one, I would pick Central.
Right. If I had to pick only one, I would pick the Central as well. But
same.
I don't think it's as effective though without having some of the boots on the ground, because you can do all the policy work and do it, but how are you actually going to then build the right relationship at the right level, which is usually at that design time and early on. So I think that's been a very valuable way to think about it over time. And you see the most successful ones tend to be ones that do that, because once you start decentralizing more, you start having a really hard time just gathering information, right? You don't know. And as you say, people, they go rogue at some point, and it's not even out of a malicious intent. It's just because there's no single, strategy or thought process or decision or review of how are you interpreting a certain requirement that's consistent. So therefore, then the variance becomes much larger, and it's much harder to clean up after the fact as well.
Yep.
So this has been great. We'll go into final comments, but Lee, any final comments before we close it down? I think we had a great discussion on the centralized versus decentralized security and compliance teams today.
Yeah, I just want to answer the question in the chat, and then we can call closing comments. So the question was, should compliance, I'll also say security function, be embedded within a business unit, in general? And what I would say is, there's some advantages to that, right? So for example, the business unit may have specific compliance requirements that would be advantageous to embed someone in there that understands the business and what they have to do. Same with security, right? Oh, we make a special thing, right? We only do hardware, so therefore we need someone that understands FIPS, for example. And the rest of the business might not need that, right? So I think there are some advantages, like we talked about, to embedding those people or having that function within there. Now, the downside is that you can get the fox watching the hen house scenario, like you've mentioned, which is that what can happen is the business can sort of gloss over or override, right, some of those concerns or controls or compliance activities in a way that, look, eventually something's going to happen, right? I mean, that's just the nature of the industry we're in, right? And so if you go back and look at that documentation and you're like, oh yeah, we encrypt that, and you look at it and you're like, no, you don't, right? And then it comes out in an audit, from a breach that you had or some customer, inquiry, like that's not going to work out well. So I do think all of the things we've talked about and balancing, the resources and the function and having some sort of centralized control can really help that. And then I do think it's up to the business unit, right? If they need specialized expertise, right, have that conversation with your security or compliance team and figure out the best model that works for you. So in closing, I would say, I think Milan and I are both vehemently in agreement, right, that centralized is the good model. However, right, I would have to say, like, if I was, the unlimited CISO with the budget and starting from scratch and could build anything that I wanted to, I would definitely go after that hybrid approach like we've talked about. Start with that centralized security team. If the business can justify it, build that out, right, to have that strong kind of governance and relationship with the rest of the function, and then embed your resources into the areas that you need the most, depending on what needs to happen. And I've seen both ways. I've seen the business units pay for the security functions and then kind of report back in. That governance model, that hub and spoke model, tends to be a little more fuzzy, right? Because that sort of business unit team can be like, I'm not going to do that, right? Yeah. And even though like they may still achieve what they want from a business standpoint, it might not achieve what the overall corporate policy is, for example, or whatever it's going to be, or there just may differences in technology stacks or whatever, and that's always not going to work out very well. So I'm a big fan in like the security, having the most control over those resources, and then really partnering with the business to get it done. So if you have the opportunity to be in that function, I highly recommend that that's what you go after.
Yeah, just one last thing, and then we will close it out for sure, is I do think, and I agree with you, that I think having, even if you have specialized area that requires specialized, I still think you need them in the central team so they don't have disconnects when policies are being written, because they may not see them ahead of time, right? Like you want to make sure you're not going to break those specialized requirements or they're considered at that time. So my only caveat is you got to be cautious of that. It can still work if they're embedded, but you just have to have a much better change management process that ensures to include them as you're going through those things. So with that, we're right at time, and I want to thank everyone who showed up today. And again, there's other topics that we kind of touched upon that go in more detail. And if you do subscribe, there's going to probably be a live stream about weekly on this channel to talk about different compliance topics. I'm going to have a very special guest coming up. I'm actually going to have a third-party auditor showing up maybe in a week, where we're going to talk about success metrics on both sides of the audit fence, both from the customer side and also the audit firm, and see how they either align or not align in expectations. So thanks again, Lee. We'll look forward to our next blog and our next chat. Thanks everyone, and have a great afternoon or day. Talk to you next time.
Yeah.